Alright guys, this is actually my second take of this. Turns out my first take was kind of long, and also let's just say it didn't record any of the stuff on the screen. So here's my second take. Welcome to the case study of number 1, simulated win via the Mythic Mob mechanics. So a bit of background about myself. My internet alias is ZDraken or Devil666 on Discord. I'm currently an engineering major college student at the time of making this video. In this video, I will attempt to apply the quote-unquote general engineering principles I have learned and try applying that to answering your Mythic Mobs questions. These PowerPoints will seem a bit redundant in the way that I write them. You may find it annoying that I literally recite what is ever written on here. I will try not to, however I am doing this in the event that someone is watching and is unable to watch with sound or audio for their own reasons, such as maybe they're deaf and they can't listen, they can't, or maybe have hearing deficiency, who knows. I'm making this so that people can still read what's on the screen and get the same amount of content. Alright, so to start off, we want to always have some broad questions, and this will be our starting point to narrow us down into what we're looking to accomplish. They fall along the lines of, in our case, how should X affect our mob? A list of assumptions here is going to be useful. I'll explain that later in the video. Does X somewhat exist in vanilla MC? Vanilla Minecraft, and be specific if possible. And the real basis behind this is that if it already exists in Minecraft, it's very likely that it's able to be manipulated. There are some cases that is not, but for most of the cases, if it exists in the vanilla code, then it's able to be modified with plugin code. So let's apply these questions and let X be simulated win. How should simulated win affect our mob, and does simulated win somewhat exist in vanilla Minecraft? So I want you to go ahead and in this video, pause it, set a 30-second timer for yourself, and use this time to answer those questions yourself. This process is meant to not spoon feed you code, as you probably looked at the form, or maybe you didn't, or were expecting this. But let me tell you right now, you will not be spoon fed code if I don't see it productive. To help you in a productive manner. And so spend this time, be interactive with the video, and really take the time to go ahead and answer these questions back here and come back, and this should help you build on the foundation of using Mythic Mobs and designing your mobs in the quote-unquote better way, in my opinion. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully you did go ahead and take a few seconds and use that time. So let's go ahead and see what my responses were, and it's okay if your responses don't line up with mine. But ask yourself, does mine make sense? Does yours make sense? Maybe they're a mix of together. So here are my answers. How should simulated win affect our mob? My two assumptions, as I told you, assumptions are very important to make. Assumption number 1 is that the mob can be lifted / is light. It wouldn't make sense if the mob was heavy, because then this simulated win would not move it. The mob would just stand there. Assumption number 2 is that the mob is shaped human-like. Zombies, pigmen, giant husks, skeletons, anything that's like bipedal and essentially relatively human-like, even villagers, for example. The reasoning behind this is that maybe, for whatever reason, spiders are lighter than zombies, or maybe spiders in Minecraft are heavier than zombies. The Wither, for example, is a boss and is probably much heavier than a zombie, but it floats, so we don't know how that works, and that might be something to look into. So let's assume that everything is a standard human-like sort of mob. If the wind pushes the mob from the front, then the mob should move back. If the wind pushes something from the very front, only from the front, then the mob should follow the path of that and move backwards. If the wind pushes the mob from below, then the mob should be lifted up. That's how wind works, or what I'm going to assume. I'm not really going to label it an assumption just because, that's kind of the mentality, kind of a general, universal, I guess, law, I want to say in my head. And to answer a second question, does simulated win somewhat exist in vanilla Minecraft? As a longtime PvPer of sorts, I know something called knockback. Knockback is one of the most frustrating things to have on a PvP server and to complain about how players don't take it, how players give too much of it, all that kind of stuff. Generally, what knockback is the manipulation of the entity's velocity, so player velocity and movement around the map. Another thing that this is sort of a stretch, but I thought of potions. There are some potions that affect movement, such as levitation, slow falling, and jump boost. Those are all kind of passive potion effects that affect how the player moves up and down, which is kind of like what wind does, to some certain extent. So the second question to ask, really, or moving forward, is can the vanilla stuff be refined in any way? And you can sort of do a thought experiment here and envision whether the mob is going to go through what we listed. So for potion effects, as I said, it's a bit of a stretch, and not so much. They really only affect the y-axis movement, such as slow falling and levitation. Levitation moves it up, and then slow falling is sort of moving down at sort of a descending rate, whereas wind would rather push you up. So if there was a sort of reversed slow falling, maybe that would work, but we don't know if that's possible. Knockback, however, is the closest thing that we have. So, it's time to consult the Bible. And no, the Bible is not the Bible that many people are referring to, but rather the MythicMobs Bible is the manual. And remember, what we're looking for here is something that resembles wind, knockback, pushing to some sort of extent, and it can be manipulated. And so there's a link to the manual. And so steps on how to better use the manual. I see too many people get frustrated with how much content there is in the manual, and it's so hard to find whatever you're looking for. And the first thing I always ask them is, did you use a search bar? There's something called the search bar, which is up in the left top corner there, where I circled in the screenshot, and this really helps you narrow down what you want. The manual could be it's analogous to an encyclopedia. If I was going to look in an encyclopedia for something, I'm not going to read every single page of it to find out what I want. I want to narrow it down. And so there's something called a table of index, and there's some table of content, table of content at the beginning, and an index at the end of the book. And those are tools that I would use to narrow down my search. Search bar is so much easier. You put in whatever you want, and it spits out whatever you want. Well, whatever you want, given some sort of parameters, and it'll figure it out what you want. And maybe it doesn't yield promising results, and that's where you move on to step 2. If it doesn't give you promising results, ask yourself the following, and remember that X refers to whatever you're looking for. So is X a simple change in a mob, such as color, angry, is it passive, the size of the mob, all those sorts of other things? It's very much likely to be in the mob options section. Is X more complex, skills that affect the mob in a dynamic way? It's more likely to be in the mechanics section. And these are things that you can find. I don't know if you can see my mouse over here, but mob options is underneath mob types in the mobs over here, and then mechanics is further down. So that's where you would want to look. Alright, so go ahead, set a timer. It's really up to you how long you want to spend on, looking into the manual and figuring out what currently exists in the manual for MythicMobs to go ahead and simulate something such as wind. Use this time to go doing that, and also, if you set a time like 10 seconds, that's not enough. The manual is quite big. There's a lot of stuff there. Maybe you're fast and can find it, but I would suggest a minimum of at least 1 minute. Don't spend too long, however, getting frustrated and giving up on this, because this video exists to help narrow down the search of what simulated wind is going to look like. Okay, so hopefully you went ahead and did all that stuff, and welcome back. So here's what I found, and these are all 4 mechanics that I found from the manual that could be something that you found or maybe you didn't find, but here you go. Velocity, lunge, leap, and jump. So let's go into my head a little bit, and being an insider, and I consider myself an insider of MythicMobs just because I played around with it extensively to the point where back when 1.8 was still supported, I had pretty much memorized the entire manual, and if I didn't, I'd always know where to search and find it. I consider myself pretty adept at finding and using what I need from the manual, and so that's what I consider to be insider. I was also one of the manual editors. So my credentials aside anyhow, From my experience, jump is only a mechanic that affects up and down movement, so purely y-axis. So if there was supposed to be wind from the front, this would not accomplish that. It would not move in a sideways, horizontal sort of direction. Leap and lunge both look like similar mechanics, and I personally have never put the time into figuring out what the hell they do. I think I tried it once or twice, but then just gave up. Like, I didn't want to go into that because I figured easier ways to get around to doing what I wanted with them. No, not with those mechanics, but other ways to do what I wanted at the time. And I'm not sure. I can't reference that time. But there were easier ways to go about what I wanted. So what do I know? What I do happen to know about them, however, is that they depend on some sort of at targeter, and this is going to, in our case for wind, maybe not always present. And so I'm going to give an example. So let's suppose you wanted a player to shoot some sort of wind element projectile at the mob, like maybe an air blast or some tornado effect or whatever. It would be easiest for the mob to react to the attack without needing to locate the target. So let's say the mob can't see the player, or the player is far away, and it casts a spell where the mob can't detect the player. And you're going to see that both lunge and leap are typically forward movements, meaning that the mob is supposed to get closer to the target. So thinking forward mechanics, maybe just put in negative values and it would just go backwards. The mob would fly backwards, right? Maybe. As I said, I don't know personally, and I wouldn't try betting on the fact that leap and lunge do exactly what you think it's going to do, because they were designed to be forward mechanics. So let's move on, and I think it's complicated in my opinion. So we narrow it down to velocity, and from the manual, as the link is there, from the manual, the definition is that it modifies the velocity of the targeted entities, maybe used on players too, useful for all sorts of things like true knockback, resistance, force skills, or simulated wind. So if you typed in wind, congratulations, you probably found this skill. Alright, so let's do some analysis on the manual entry. Does the example, let's look to the example, make sense? And yes, is what I'm going to tell you here and now. The squiggly thing is called a tootle. Tootle on damage refers to when the mob is hit. And at self indicates that, the mob is going to change its own velocity in this case. The mode is set to set, meaning like it will literally at that moment change the mob's velocity all to whatever values you later set to. And in this case, for the example, all X, Y, and Z are set to 0, resulting in an instant change in the mob's velocity to none. And this simulates anti-knockback. It's analogous to, you punching a zombie and it taking knockback and flying backwards. Whereas if you punched a block, it doesn't move because the block is a block. It's resisting knockback. It's truly static in that sense. So there are some caveats to velocity, so I want you to go ahead and take a closer look at what the example text actually explains. This example will stop all momentum of the casting mob upon taking damage. The effect will only last until the mob decides to move again or is moved by other sources. Read that again, and you should probably find that now you see the effect will only last until the mob decides to move again or is moved by other sources. So what does this mean? Simply put, velocity is a mechanic that changes the instantaneous velocity of a mob. I'm sorry if you don't like physics, I don't either, but let me try to explain this. The movement of the mob, the moment the mob begins moving on its own, or is moved by other sources, in this case, the velocity mechanic will cease to work. So when you punch that mob, and it suddenly decides after it gets punched to start moving towards you, it will no longer, it will have its normal knockback. Whereas, you punched it and it didn't seem to move. But anytime afterwards, that velocity mechanic no longer exists. Okay, so can we still use this? It's very likely because the manual editors put in that simulated wind is one thing that you could try using this for. So you can go ahead and try that out. However, before we do that, we need to go ahead and design some cases to test this way so you don't go in blind and trying to guess and check certain values when you're really doing this all yourself. Really, this is all a process-oriented mentality in learning how to use MythicMobs manual to better your mobs and mob development skills. So, one thing that's very important to do is to always make assumptions whenever appropriate. Making assumptions allows for the elimination of any other possible variables that would otherwise be present in our testing. And so one great assumption would be to test the velocity of that mob. The mob needs to have no AI. It needs to have negligible movement of its own. Negligible is a fancy word for it can be accounted as 0. It doesn't matter. And why this is so important is because, as with the caveat mentioned earlier, if the mob does decide to move, maybe it moves and we don't see that effect anymore. We don't see how velocity actually changes the mob. So we want to isolate this as much as possible. So, if the mob decides to move on its own or is moved by something else, we want to isolate the effects of just velocity mechanic, and this will allow us to do that. So now we have 3 assumptions, and this is added to our assumptions list. The mob can be lifted / light. The mob is shaped like human-like. And assumption number 3, now the mob must have negligible self-movement or ideally no AI of its own. And so here we're going to outline the cases. Case 1, in my opinion, should always be using the default values. In this case, the manual says it's +1. And the reason why is because I would like to think that the default values of every mechanic are pretty much, the intended use of the mechanic, I would say. But this may not always be the case, and it may just be that Ash, developer of the plugin, just decided to plug in those values just to make his life easy. Assign some sort of default value. So in case someone doesn't mention it when their code, the whole plugin doesn't just break. Case number 2. You're going to want to use negative default values. And the reason why is so that you can observe the effects of this. If you can observe the effects of whether it's equal and opposite to how the mob behaves with all the positive default values. And case number 3 is going to be fractional values. Start with all the positives and then the negatives. Make a mental picture of how you think it will affect the mob after seeing case 1 and 2. So this assumes that you're going to be doing case 1 first, and then you're going to move on to case 2, and you're going to move on to case 3. So this is a timeline progression of events. And case number 4 is very similar to case number 3 in that you're still doing some sort of scaling, but reason why I classify it by itself is because fractional values is scaling down, and scaling, the word usually kind of means moving up, and so I'm going to consider its own case here. So case number 4, scaling inputs. If all the inputs, the x, y, and z velocities that you put in, are twice the amount of the positive default values, so meaning like 2 in this case, will the output / result be twice as much? You have to figure out the relationship of the input and output. Maybe it is twice as much, and that would be a linear proportional relationship. So if you put in y amount into the input, then y amount comes out on the output. But maybe you put something in and it gives you 3 times as much or 5 times as much. I don't know. The thing is, I don't know off the top of my head what this mechanic does, and I'm not going to go through it to really debug that, at least not at this time, and really figure out how this mechanic really works for myself. This is all just a video to get you started on how to use the manual and get forward with discovering mechanics that you think will work for what you're trying to make for your mod to do. So to get started, you're going to according to our assumptions, we're going to need a mob that is human-like, affected by the velocity mechanic, and has no AI. So go ahead and consult the manual, get your starting code out, write it out if you already know what it is and where I'm headed with this, and go through each case as listed before with the velocity mechanics. You're going to start up your server, you're going to start MythicMobs, make sure everything's working and all that, and start coding this out. And so here, I'm going to be nice, and I'm going to start giving you a snippet of starting code. This is spoon-fed code, yes, but this is such basic spoon-fed code that I don't feel too bad that it's not going to hinder your ability to really investigate what is going on with the velocity mechanic to make simulated wind effects. So note that I use Sublime, it's a program, and I use Mac. So you can, with this program, you can get something that's color-coded, and it's very easy on the eyes to identify YAML errors or YAML syntax. And YAML is essentially the format of your files of plugins that can be treated as a text file. You can open up a text editor and start editing different stuff. That is YAML. So to do this, you're going to want to go to the right bottom corner of this the window and click on it. and scroll all the way down to where it says YAML. And YAML syntax will give this beautiful, red, yellow, and purple. You can change the color scheme, but this is the default of Sublime. This is what I use. So here's some of the starting code. Let me go ahead and break it down for you. So I call the internal mob name Velocity Mob. The mob type is going to be a pig zombie, and you can see in my comment that I explain I chose this mob type so I don't have to worry about the daylight burning it. It really irks me whenever I see a zombie kind of like just burning, and I don't want it to die necessarily, but I also don't want it to even see it on fire. And so there's many ways to go about this. You can put fire resistance right when the mob spawns. You can set the damage modifier so it doesn't take damage from fire ticks, but I found that you can still see the mob that's on fire. So generally I just avoid all that by setting it to pig zombie. It's very easy for me. The display name can literally be whatever you want. I called it velocity case study in this case. The health is going to be set to 20. The options in the mob are going to be no AI. This is self-explanatory because we don't want the mob to have any mind of its own and start changing the velocity after it applies the velocity mechanic. Invincible is also set to true, and this is just out of convenience so that the mob does not die on us, and it is to my belief that the option can still work with the on damage trigger condition, because on damage refers not necessarily to whether the mob takes damage, but whether or not you hit it with the left click button of your mouse. And so if it's not the case and I'm wrong, then just simply set a really high amount of health, or go into the skills below and set a self-heal mechanic that has an on timer of, like, let's say 20 ticks. So every 1 second it's going to heal itself. That way the mob doesn't die. You won't even know this because it's not going to display its health to you unless you have some sort of other plugin or mechanic that tells you that. So finally in the skills, I went ahead and just took from syntax from the manual. Velocity M mode is equal to set x1, y1, z1. These are all default values, and this is case 1. So what this skill says is every time you punch that mob with a left click action, it will run this velocity, and you're going to see how the mob reacts. And from here on out, I want you to use this starting code as a template and go have fun with all the cases and figure out what velocity does. And then go back to the question of, can you make this like simulated win? I imagine you're going to need some sort of, maybe different values, so the X, Y, and Z are not all the same values. Rather, they're all fine-tuned to have some sort of decimal value, some sort of scaled, bigger values. Just figure it out and investigate this. And so at this point, I want to say thank you to a piece of crap, period, 9575. He's the one that asked this on my Google form question, asking about how the mechanic works, and I really didn't have the time to go into debugging it completely. If you're interested in that, I'll honestly need to have more interest in this, so I make a series or something like that. And the video here was just meant to get people started with looking into the mechanic and having the sort of process-oriented mindset of using the manual as efficiently as possible. No one wants to be swamped in the Bible and figure out how to do one specific thing, and no one wants to be bothered, or embarrassed rather, asking in the Discord or anywhere else of like, hey, how do I do this? And everyone's like, ha ha ha, you don't know how, or go read the manual. So do what they ask, go read the manual, but read it in a smarter way. And I want to say thank you to you, the viewer or viewers, if there's multiple people who watch this, for just watching. Yeah, this took some time on my part to make and record this. So I just want to say thank you. And that concludes the case study 1.